HOA Karen threw a wedding in Big Shaq's yard. So he let his cows join the celebration. What would you do if your new neighbor kept stealing from you? Drop by drop, Jamal Brooks thought he had moved into a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. But when his water bill mysteriously skyrocketed, he discovered a shocking betrayal just across the hedge. The culprit, Cynthia Holloway, the self-appointed queen of the block, who thought his garden hose was hers to use. But Jamal wasn't about to stay silent. What followed next was a battle of wits, petty revenge, and a final twist so outrageous, it literally stank. Stick around because you won't believe how one man turned sewage into sweet poetic justice. You ever wake up, look out your window and see a full wedding set up in your backyard? Yeah, that happened to me, and trust me, I wasn't invited. Big Shaq blinked his eyes open to the sound of birds chirping in the distant hum of a tractor. He stretched out of bed in his cozy farmhouse, the morning sun filtering through the window in a soft golden glow. The air was fresh crisp, the kind that smelled of freshly cut grass and cool dew. It was the perfect Saturday morning in Greenidge, a quiet little town where everyone knew everyone, and peace was the norm. Nothing ever seemed out of place here. But as he slowly rolled over and reached for his coffee mug, his gaze drifted to the window. His eyes squinted in confusion, unsure if he was still asleep. White tents, floral arches, strings of twinkling lights, and dozens of strangers dressed in formal attire setting up a wedding in his backyard. Shaq rubbed his eyes and glanced at the clock. 7:15 a.m. This had to be a dream. He grabbed his slippers, walked to the window, and stared outside. The scene was straight out of some grand fairy tale. A lavish spread of tables draped in white linen champagne glasses stacked in delicate towers, and a string quartet rehearsing on the far side of the garden like they were preparing for a royal ceremony. Shaq's frown deepened. This wasn't a dream. His backyard was a disaster zone, and none of these people had asked for permission. With a grunt, he grabbed his phone and dialed the only person who could be behind this. Carla Prescott, the ADA president of Greenidge, formerly known as Karen by most residents. Always had something to say, always had an opinion on everything. If anyone had the nerve to pull this off, it would be her. "Shaq, darling, it's Carla." Her overly perky voice answered, dripping with faux sweetness. "What the hell is going on in my backyard?" Shaq grumbled, his voice low and steady despite the rising storm of anger inside him. "Oh, relax. It's a wedding, sweetheart," Carla said, a laugh in her tone, as if this was nothing out of the ordinary. The couple paid HOA for the space, and well, it's going to be beautiful. This neighborhood deserves a touch of class, don't you think? Shaq's blood boiled. His backyard wasn't part of the HOA's domain, and he sure as hell hadn't given anyone permission to use it. He wasn't one to cause trouble. He liked his peace, but this was a line crossed. He gritted his teeth. "Carla, this is my land, not HOA property. You can't just waltz in here and set up a damn wedding." Carla's voice oozed condescension. "Oh, Shaq, don't be such a sour apple. Everyone deserves a little fun, and this wedding is for the benefit of the whole neighborhood. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy the festivities." "Carla, I don't care what you think is best for the neighborhood. Get your people off my land." He ended the call before she could respond, and Shaq felt the heat of anger surge through his chest. He wasn't going to stand for this. He'd spent too many years watching her undermine him, criticize his property, and make his life difficult. Today, things were going to be different. A familiar honk rang out from the side of the barn. Sergeant Honkers, his notorious goose, waddled around honking loudly like he was preparing for battle. Shaq smirked. "You want a party, Carla? Oh, let's give you one to remember." Big Shaq's farmhouse sat on the outskirts of Green Ridge, a sleepy little town where everyone knew everyone and everyone's business was on display for all to see. The kind of town where the most exciting thing that ever happened was the annual harvest festival or the occasional thunderstorm that knocked out power for a few hours. Shaq, however, was a man who enjoyed his quiet life. He had no interest in town gossip, nor did he care much about the latest HOA rule that required residents to paint their front doors a specific shade of beige. His focus was simple: take care of his animals, maintain his farm, and keep to himself. That was his way. At 43, Shaq had built up a reputation in the neighborhood, but it wasn't one that people necessarily respected. He was a veteran, having served in the military for 20 years before retiring to his small farm. His property, though modest, was his pride and joy. There was no grandeur in the house, but it had character, rustic, comfortable, and filled with memories. It was the perfect retreat from the hustle and bustle of town life. Then, of course, there was his animal family. 2 goats named Tina and Ted, 3 cows, Maggie, Duke, and Sally, and the infamous Sergeant Honkers, a goose with a temperament fiercer than most dogs. Sergeant Honkers wasn't just any goose. He was Shaq's wingman, his loyal companion, and a true terror to anyone who dared cross the farm's gates. A few people had learned that the hard way. The animals were not just pets. They were part of Shaq's everyday life, his comrades in solitude. But despite his idyllic life, one name in Greenwich had always caused Shaq trouble: Carla Prescott. Carla wasn't just the HOA president, and she believed she ran the entire neighborhood. In fact, she often acted as if she were the self-appointed queen of Greenwich, dictating everything from lawn maintenance to which flowers people could plant in their gardens. A retired schoolteacher with far too much time on her hands, Carla had taken it upon herself to enforce an almost militant standard of decorum. Her favorite pastime was riding around in her pastel pantsuits, clipboard in hand, ticking off violations from every house on her list. Shaq had long been her target. She had made it clear that she didn't approve of his messy farm. His animals, in her eyes, were nothing but an eyesore, and his house was a tacky collection of mismatched windows and paint that had long faded into dull shades of gray and brown. The HOA meetings were where Shaq first clashed with Carla. She would stand at the front, her hands folded in front of her as if she were the principal, passing judgment on every little thing Shaq did or didn't do. The meetings were an exercise in restraint for him. Carla, on the other hand, thrived on finding ways to undermine him. She'd make snide remarks about his animals, about the way he ran his farm, and how he should clean up his property to meet the HOA standards. But the thing that truly grated Shaq's nerves was the way Carla belittled him. She talked down to him like he was some sort of simpleton, as if he didn't deserve to be there in that room with all the proper members of the community. It wasn't just the farm she disapproved of. It was him, the way he carried himself, the way he lived. He was an outsider in Carla's eyes, someone who didn't fit into the pristine cookie-cutter mold she so desperately wanted Greenwich to be. And today, standing at the window of his farmhouse watching the wedding party set up on his land, Shaq felt that familiar itch of frustration. This was just another move in Carla's ongoing battle to control everything around her. But this time she had crossed a line. Shaq walked across the creaky wooden floor of his kitchen, the scent of his freshly brewed coffee filling the air as he grabbed a mug from the cabinet. The coffee was black, just the way he liked it. There was no time for cream or sugar when you had a situation like this on your hands. He had to confront Carla again. He stood by the window, staring out at the growing crowd in his backyard. They were setting up the final touches. The floral arrangements, the tables, the chairs, and everything looked so perfect. It was as if they decided to take over his life and make it part of their fairy tale. The nerve of it. And then in the corner of his vision, Shaq spotted Sergeant Honkers waddling toward the gate, his webbed feet slapping against the ground with purpose. Shaq chuckled softly to himself. It seemed his goose had an agenda of his own. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a brief moment Shaq closed his eyes, trying to collect his thoughts. But that only lasted a second. The anger was still there, bubbling beneath the surface. "You get off my property," Carla, Shaq muttered under his breath, the words sharp and heavy. He had put up with Carlo's antics for too long. It was time to take matters into his own hands. Suddenly he heard a sound, an unmistakable honk, sharp and loud. She turned toward the barn where Sergeant Honker stood, his head held high, chest puffed out as if he were ready for war. The goose flapped his wings aggressively, already sensing the disturbance in the air. She grinned. There was something about Honker's fierceness that always made him feel a little better. If anyone could stir things up and make Carla's precious wedding a mess, it was him. Shaq grabbed the door handle, the wooden door creaking as he opened it. The air outside was thick with tension, and the chaos in his backyard was only just beginning. He slowly walked to the animal pens, locking eyes with Sergeant Honker's, who was now standing at attention, ready for the first command. "Let's give them a show they won't forget," Shaq whispered, the smirk never leaving his face. The plan was simple. Shaq opened the gates to his animals, and they surged out like a wave crashing against the shore. Tina and Ted the goats charged first, their hooves pounding against the dirt as they made their way toward the wedding setup. The cows, sluggish but curious, followed suit. They lumbered along, more interested in the buffet spread than anything else. And then, of course, Sergeant Honkers, who took off like a missile, honking with fury as he aimed straight for the flower arrangements. She locked the door behind him and stood by the window sipping his coffee. A small, satisfied smile spread across his face as the storm he'd unleashed unfolded before him. Shaq watched as the chaos in his backyard began to unfold, a sense of grim satisfaction settling in his chest. He could hear the distant shouts of confusion and surprise, the shrieks of wedding guests as his animals ran rampant through the venue. It was like something out of a cartoon. Yet the chaos felt just right, just what Carla deserved after all the time she had belittled him. Out of the corner of his eye, Shaq saw Carla emerged from the crowd. Dressed in her signature pastel pants, suit her hair immaculately styled, she was the picture of control. Or at least that's how she liked to project herself. But right now, as she clutched her champagne flute like a lifeline and tried to maintain some semblance of order, it was clear that control was slipping through her fingers. Shaq sighed, setting his coffee cup down on the windowsill. It was time to face her. This wasn't going to stop until he put an end to it. With a slow, deliberate movement, he opened the door and stepped outside into the madness. The wind had picked up, scattering the delicate white ribbons that had been strung across the yard. In the distance, a goat was chewing on a floral arrangement, completely unbothered by the havoc it was causing. The cows, on the other hand, seemed more interested in the spread of hors d'oeuvres in the overflowing punch bowl that had been set up near the dance floor. Sergeant Honkers, ever the troublemaker, was on a rampage, honking aggressively as he chased down a group of guests, clearly enjoying the terror he was inflicting. Shaq took a deep breath, his feet steady beneath him, as he walked toward the center of the backyard. Carla spotted him immediately and made a beeline for him, her face flushed with a mix of frustration and desperation. "Shaw, what the hell do you think you're doing?" she yelled, her voice rising over the chaotic den. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments, and now the sound of flapping wings, bleating goats, and shouting guests filled the air. Shaq gave her a blank look. "I'm doing exactly what you should have done a long time ago, taking control of this situation." Carla's eyes narrowed. She took a quick sip from her mimosa, as if trying to steady herself. "This is an event for the whole neighborhood, Shaq. It's a wedding, a sacred occasion. And you," she jabbed a finger at him, "are ruining everything." Shaq folded his arms over his chest, feeling his jaw tighten with each word she spoke. Sacred occasion. Really? You didn't even ask me if you could use my land. That's trespassing, Carla, and you know it. Her smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. The couple paid the HOA for this. We've got all the permissions we need, and you?" She waved her hand dismissively. "You're just being difficult." Shock's temper flared, the way she dismissed his concerns like they were nothing but a minor inconvenience. She really thought she could get away with anything. He clenched his fists, his body tense, but he took a deep breath. It was too easy to let his anger take control, and he wasn't going to let her see him lose his cool. Not today. "I don't care about your permissions," Carla Shaq said, his voice low but unwavering. "My land, my rules, and you've got no right to be here." Carla's eyes flashed with irritation, but she kept her composure, straightening her back and lifting her chin. "Oh, Shaq, don't be such a sour apple. This is all for the good of the neighborhood. You're just upset because we're having a nice event and you've never been the type to enjoy things like this." Shaq almost laughed. Carla didn't get it. She didn't understand that it wasn't about the wedding. It was about respect. She had never respected him. Not once. Not in the countless HOA meetings where she had made snide comments about his property. Not in the way she had always acted as if he didn't belong in Green Ridge. It wasn't about the wedding. It was about her constantly overstepping and assuming she had the right to control everything. Shaq took a step closer to Carla, his gaze hardening. "You've always treated me like I don't belong here, like I'm some kind of outsider. You've made my life difficult for years, and now you think you can just waltz in and take over my property. No, this ends now." Carla's eyes narrowed in defiance, but she quickly shifted gears. "You're just jealous, aren't you? Jealous that you don't have something like this. A nice, elegant wedding class." Shaq's face didn't change, but inside he could feel his blood begin to boil. "Class, is that what you call this, destroying my animal's habitat for your fancy wedding?" Before Carla could respond, a loud honk interrupted her. Sergeant Honkers, no longer content with terrorizing the guests, had moved on to bigger targets. He had taken aim at the floral archway, and now in full glory he was charging at it, honking like a siren and flapping his wings with the fury of a battle-ready soldier. The wedding guests screamed, scattering in all directions, as the goose made his way through the flowers, knocking over vases, flapping his wings, as if he had just declared war on the entire ceremony. The bride's dress, already stained with goat saliva, was now being trampled by one of Shaq's cows, who had discovered that the orurves were far tastier than any grass in the field. Carla's face drained of color as she spun around, horrified by the destruction unfolding around her. "This is a disaster. You've ruined everything." Shaq, his arms still crossed over his chest, couldn't help but smirk. The sound of chaos of animals rampaging and guests running for cover was oddly satisfying. It was all coming together. This is exactly what you get when you think you can control everyone and everything. You had no right to be here, Carla, and now you've got to face the consequences. Shaq stood there watching the spectacle unfold with a quiet satisfaction. But beneath his calm exterior, a storm was brewing. Carla was now running around the yard, frantically trying to fix the damage, tripping over speaker wires and knocking over champagne towers in the process. She looked ridiculous, flustered, and completely out of her element. It was almost poetic watching the perfect world she had tried so hard to create unravel in real time. But as much as Shaq wanted to bask in the chaos, and there was a part of him that wasn't fully at peace. His gaze shifted to the corner of his backyard where Sergeant Honkers was still wreaking havoc, chasing a bewildered flower girl around the arch. The poor girl was doing her best to run in her little heels, but the goose was faster and angrier. It seemed like the more frantic the wedding became, the more Shaq's animals reveled in it. It was, in its own way, beautiful. Yet even as he watched, a strange, gnawing feeling crept up on him. Was this really what he wanted? Was this what he had worked so hard for, bringing Carla's grand event crashing down? It wasn't just about the wedding. Shaq knew that. It had never been just about a single event. It was about every slight, every condescending word Carla had ever thrown at him. It was about every HOA meeting where she'd looked at him like he didn't belong. It was about the years of frustration that had built up, festering in the corners of his mind, never quite going away. Today, he wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for his dignity. Shaq's mind wandered back to all those HOA meetings, all the petty disagreements over minor details. Whether the grass was too long or the fence wasn't symmetrical enough, Carla had always been the one to lead the charge, making him feel like he was in the wrong, like he was somehow, less than everyone else. He had never, asked for her approval, but she made sure to offer it anyway, whether he wanted it or not. Every time she judged his property, his animals, it felt like a jab, a reminder that he was different, an outsider in the neighborhood he had called home for years. And now it seemed like she had crossed the line. This wasn't about the wedding. It was about everything she had done to him over the years. It was about how she had made him feel small, how she had made him feel like his life wasn't good enough for her or for the rest of Green Ridge. The anger bubbled up again. But this time, Shaq caught himself. He knew he could let it all out, storm over there, confront Carla, and make her feel as humiliated as he had felt for years. He could make sure she paid for what she had done, not just today, but in every other instance where she had belittled him. But that wasn't what he wanted, not really. But what he wanted was respect. And for that, he didn't need to sink to her level. The sergeant honkers. Enough. Shaq called out, his voice clear and commanding. The goose, who had been on the warpath for the last few minutes, immediately stopped in his tracks. He honked one more time, loud and triumphant, before waddling back towards Shaq as if he knew the job was done. The damage had been done. The message had been sent. Shaq ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts swirling as he watched the chaos continue in his backyard. Carla scrambling to regain control. Guests looking utterly bewildered and his animals happily scattering the remnants of the wedding. He knew there was more at play here. This wasn't just about getting back at Carla. This was about something deeper. He had always kept to himself. He wasn't one for conflict, never liked being the center of attention. But this time something inside him had snapped. This time the line had been crossed. He could feel the weight of all the years of humiliation and frustration pressing down on him, threatening to suffocate him. And when he thought about it, he realized something else. He didn't just want Carla to pay for her disrespect. He wanted her to understand what it felt like to be dismissed, to be made to feel invisible, to be made to feel like you were never good enough. The conflict inside him wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his sense of self, about reminding Carla that he had a voice, that he had a place in Green Ridge just as much as she did. Shaq's fingers tightened around the edge of the window ledge. He could already hear the murmurs of the guests, some of them laughing nervously, others trying to salvage whatever dignity they could. He caught sight of one woman, her wedding dress now covered in a mixture of goat saliva and mud, trying to hold it together, her mascara running as she dabbed her eyes. It was a mess, pure chaos. But in that mess, Shaq found a strange sense of clarity. He wasn't going to let this moment be wasted. The storm that was brewing inside him wasn't just anger, it was something else, something deeper. It was a lesson for Carla, a reminder that no one was untouchable. No one could make you feel small forever. It was his way of standing up for himself, not with a fight, not with words, but with actions. He wasn't going to let her control him anymore. But, as he stood there watching the wedding disintegrate around him, something else caught his attention. It wasn't just Carla anymore. There were people from the HOA watching from the sidelines, their eyes wide in disbelief. It was a rare sight. People from the same neighborhood, who had once turned their backs on him, now watching as his animals caused havoc in their perfect world. It was as if for the first time they were seeing the reality of Shaq, not the caricature that Carla had painted for them. Shaq's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just about Carl anymore. The other HOA members were starting to see what he had endured for all these years. They were witnessing the truth unfold before them. The truth about, Carla. About the way she had treated him and the way she had tried to control everyone around her. He knew in that moment that this wasn't just about winning today. It was about something far bigger. It was about showing the entire neighborhood that he was more than just the man Carla had tried to define him as. He was someone who deserved to be heard. A sense of resolve settled in his chest. Whatever came next, Shaq knew he was ready. The battle had just begun. The chaos in Shaq's backyard was nothing short of a spectacle. The wedding, once a picture of elegance and grace, had devolved in a pure anarchy. Guests were running in every direction, their designer outfits covered in dirt and goat saliva, while the cows lazily strolled through the buffet table, nibbling on anything they could find. As Sergeant Honkers was still on a rampage, chasing after anyone who dared to come too close, honking like a siren at a high-speed chase. Meanwhile, Carla, standing in the center of it all, looked as though she had been hit by a tornado of her own making. She was mess, her pastel pantsuit once pristine and polished was now covered in stains, and her perfectly styled hair had come undone, the strands falling into her face as she tried to regain some semblance of order. Every time she attempted to control the situation, it seemed to spin further out of her grasp. It was like watching a master puppeteer desperately trying to regain control of a puppet show that had gone horribly wrong. A check. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't rushing around to help. No. He stood at the edge of the chaos, a quiet observer, sipping his coffee with an air of calm. It wasn't that he didn't care about the destruction happening in his backyard. It was that he knew this was exactly what had to happen. Carla needed to feel the consequences of her actions. The plan had been set in motion, and there was no turning back now. He had been preparing for this moment for years. Every slight, every sneer, every humiliating remark Carla had made over the years had been a building block for this day. The day he would finally take control of the situation. The day he would let the neighborhood see Carla for what she truly was, a bully who thought she could trample over anyone who didn't fit her idea of perfection. Shaq took another sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing as he observed the chaos unfolding. His goats were having the time of their lives, chewing on flowers, causing a frenzy with their playful antics. The cows, slow and deliberate, had made their way to the hors d'oeuvre table, happily munching on the spread of pastries and fruits, as if they had never tasted anything better. Or me and Sergeant Honkers Shaq's trusty, unpredictable goose was still on a tear, terrorizing anyone within reach. There was no stopping it now. As the scene unfolded, Shaw felt a sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. The animals were doing their part, wreaking havoc, just as he had intended. He didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. The animals had taken care of everything. The work was done. Now it was just a matter of letting Carla stew in her own mess. He could see her running around, her face flushed with frustration. Guests were filming everything on their phones, capturing the madness for all to see. Shaq couldn't help but smirk. She had made this event into a spectacle too. But now it was her turn to be the one on display. Her desperate attempts to restore order were futile. The animals had won. The wedding was ruined soon, and Carla's reputation was, as far as Shaq was concerned, shattered. But even as he stood there watching, Shaq knew this wasn't just about humiliating Carla. It wasn't just about getting back at her for the years of disrespect. This was about justice. It was about standing up for himself and for the way he had been treated. It was about showing everyone that there were consequences for acting like the world revolved around you. Carla had taken his land without permission, treated him like an outsider in his own community, and now she was going to face the consequences. Shaq knew that despite the satisfaction of watching her run around like a headless chicken, the real confrontation was yet to come. He had made sure to gather his evidence. He wasn't just going to let her walk away from this unscathed. No, he had a plan in place, and it was about to unfold. He moved toward the back porch, where he had left a folder containing the necessary documents, his property map proof that the land she had borrowed for this wedding wasn't HOA property. But his, and with that document, he could show the world that she had no legal right to set foot on his land. Shaq wasn't a man to get involved in petty arguments, but when someone stepped on his toes like Carla had done time and time again, there was only so much he could take. Shaq looked out over the scene one last time. The guests were still scattered, some of them trying to salvage what was left of their perfect day. The bride, her wedding dress now stained and torn, stood in the corner, her face a mixture of disbelief and shock. The groom's family was huddled together, their heads shaking in disbelief. Carla, meanwhile, was frantically trying to restore her some semblance of order, but it was clear to anyone who was watching that the situation had slipped far beyond her control. She was a puppet with no strings left to pull. Shaq took one last breath, steeling himself for what he knew was coming. It was time to make his move. He reached for the folder, the weight of it in his hands, feeling like the weight of justice itself. He walked slowly back toward the chaos, his steps deliberate, measured. As he reached the edge of the yard, he could hear Carla's voice ringing out above the noise. "This man is sabotaging! Fakered event!" She screamed, her words shaky with panic. The guests, now filming everything, looked on in confusion as Carla tried to regain control of the situation. She pointed at Shaq, blaming him for the mess that had unfolded. But Shaq wasn't worried. He had something much stronger than her accusations. He had the truth, and that truth was about to come crashing down on her. With a calm, steady movement, Shaq stepped forward, holding the folder in his hands. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to make a scene. He simply raised the folder, holding it high for everyone to see. "I'm not the one sabotaging anything, Carla," Shaq said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is my land, and you've trespassed. You owe me an apology, and maybe you'll want to pay for the damages you've caused." The crowd fell silent for a moment as they processed his words. Carla's face went white as she realized the gravity of the situation. She had no legal claim to this land, no permission from Shaq, no valid reason for any of this to have happened. And now, with the truth in front of them, the guests and the other HOA members were starting to turn on her that it was over. The storm Shaq had unleashed was coming to an end. But the real consequences were only just beginning. The atmosphere in Shaq's backyard was nothing short of chaos, a spectacle unlike anything the quiet town of Green Ridge had ever witnessed. As the first few notes of the string quartet faded into the distance, replaced by the frantic bleats of goats and the loud honking of Sergeant Honkers, the wedding that had been meticulously planned was slowly unraveling thread by thread. Every second that passed seemed to add to the madness. Shaq watched from the sidelines, a small smile curling at the corner of his lips. For the first time in years, it felt good to be in control. The guests who had arrived in droves to witness what was supposed to be a beautiful ceremony were now scattered around the yard in various states of distress. Some had managed to gather themselves and were standing off to the side, their phones raised as they captured the unfolding chaos for all to see. Others were frantically trying to salvage whatever was left of the event, but it was no use. There was no fixing this now. It started with the goats. Tina and Ted, the two mischievous creatures, had already caused a scene by snatching a guest's sun hat and tearing it apart in front of her. One woman shrieked as Tina ate the ribbons off her hat, the goat chewing with an almost maniacal determination. The woman screamed and tried to pull her hat away, but Tina wasn't having it. The hat was soon reduced to ribbons of fabric scattered across the grass. The guests stood in shock, unsure whether to laugh or cry. One brave soul attempted to chase after the goats, but with little success. They were too fast, too clever, darting between the guests and causing an even greater ruckus. Meanwhile, the cows had discovered the banquet tables. Sluggish and unbothered by the frenzy around them, they wandered over to the buffet, their large bodies bumping into chairs and tables as they nibbled at the pastries, fruits, and ordered errors laid out for the guests. A large plate of shrimp cocktails was knocked over the slippery crustaceans sliding across the table, only to be devoured by Dyke, the largest cow, who happily licked his lips after every bite. The buffet, once a centerpiece of elegance, had now become a free-for-all for Shaq's livestock. Shaq couldn't help but chuckle quietly as the cows grazed at the buffet. It was a scene straight out of a slapstick comedy, only it was happening in his backyard. There was no denying the satisfaction of watching Carla's picture-perfect wedding unravel. But deep down, Shaq knew it was more than just a joke. This was the culmination of years of frustration, years of feeling like he didn't belong in this neighborhood. And now, with his animals on the loose and Carla running around like a headless chicken, he could feel the weight of every injustice that had been done to him over the years slowly lifting. But it wasn't just the animals causing mayhem. The real star of the show, of course, was Sergeant Honkers. The goose had already terrorized several guests, but now he was setting his sights on the wedding arch. As the flower girl attempted to flee from Honker's path, the goose flapped his wings with alarming force, his honks growing louder and more desperate. The poor girl, barely able to outrun the determined bird, tripped over the base of the arch, sending it tumbling to the ground with resounding crash. Guests gasped, hands flying to their mouths in shock as the flower arrangements were crushed under the weight of the fallen arch. The bride, who had been standing with her father at the front, had no idea what was happening behind her until the chaos reached her. She turned just in time to see one of Shaq's cows, Maggie, happily licking her wedding dress. Leaving a trail of slobber behind her, the bride shrieked her high-pitched scream, cutting through the noise of the disaster. "Then no, not my dress," she wailed, trying to tug it out of Maggie's reach. But the cow was unfazed, continuing to munch on the fabric with a slobbery determination. "Get off, you stupid cow!" The bride cried, her voice cracking with frustration as the cow snorted happily, oblivious to the damage it was causing. The wedding guests, now fully realizing the extent of the disaster, scattered in every direction. Some ran toward the safety of the house, while others fumbled for their phones, eager to document the unfolding catastrophe. Carla, meanwhile, was in full panic mode. She darted around the yard, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. Every time she tried to make her way to the front of the wedding, another disaster struck. One of the string quartet musicians, who had long since abandoned his post, was now trying to corral a goat that had stolen his violin case. Another guest, a man in a tuxedo, was trying to shoo Sergeant Honkers away from the bridal party, but the goose only honked louder and flapped his wings in protest. It was clear that Carla had lost all control of the situation. Desperately, Carla grabbed the microphone from a nearby stand, her fingers trembling as she spoke into it. "This man," she pointed toward Shaq, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear, "is sabotaging a sacred event. This is an atrocity." Her words were met with stunned silence as the guests turned to look at Shaq, who was standing in the back arms, crossed, a cool smirk playing at the corners of his lips. The more Carla raged, the more the guests seemed to realize that the blame for this disaster wasn't on Shaq. It wasn't his animals that had caused this chaos. It was Carla's own arrogance, her sense of entitlement, and her complete disregard for the rules. She had trespassed on Shaq's land, treated him like an outsider in his own community, and now she was reaping what she had sown. Shaq took a step forward, the crowd parting for him as he walked toward the center of the lawn. His eyes never left Carla, who was now frantic, her face twisted in disbelief as she realized the extent of the situation. The cameras were rolling, capturing every second of her humiliation. She had nowhere to hide. "Carla." Shaq said, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the chaos like a knife. "You've been calling the shots for far too long. You've tried to control this neighborhood, tried to control me, and now look at what you've done. This is your mess, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The crowd murmured in agreement. And for the first time, Carla seemed to falter. She was a woman used to control, to being the one who held all the power. But now the tables had turned. She was no longer the one in charge. The damage was done, and there was no going back. Shaq took a step back, folding his arms across his chest, watching as the situation continued to unfold. He didn't need to do anything more. The chaos was doing all the work for him. This was Carla's reckoning, and no amount of scrambling was going to fix it. Now the chaos in Shaq's backyard was now complete. The once beautiful wedding venue had become a scene of utter destruction. The guests, many of whom had arrived in anticipation of a perfect day, now stood on the periphery, their phones raised high to capture the unfolding madness. It was as if the entire neighborhood had gathered, not for a celebration, but for a spectacle. A spectacle in which Carla Prescott, the self-appointed Queen of Greenwich, was finally being exposed for what she truly was. A woman who believed she could control everything and everyone without consequence. As Shaq stood back, arms crossed, watching with a quiet satisfaction, he couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. The guests were no longer just spectators. They were becoming witnesses, and the truth about Carla, her arrogance, her disregard for the rules, and her absolute need to control was slowly coming to light. The very people she had once manipulated, the same people she had tried to impress with her so-called perfect events and HOA rules, were now seeing her in a completely different light. Carla, her face flushed with panic and humiliation, clutched the microphone in her trembling hands, her words shaky as she tried to maintain some semblance of authority. This man," she said, her voice rising in frustration, "is sabotaging a sacred event. He's ruining everything." Her voice cracked with the weight of her anger, but there was no hiding the desperation in her tone. The crowd, initially sympathetic to her claims, now seemed uncertain. They had seen her as the leader, the woman who made all the rules. But the truth was hard to ignore, and her out-of-control weddings had proven to everyone just how out of touch she was. Shaq couldn't help but let out a small chuckle, but he quickly stifled it. This was his moment, and he knew it. As Carla continued to shout into the microphone, attempting to rally the guests against him, Shaq stepped forward, walking. His steps were slow, deliberate, each one a reminder that he was no longer the man who had been belittled and humiliated for years. He was the man who had taken back control. The guests fell silent as Shaq approached. Their eyes shifted from him to Carla, and it was clear that the tide was turning. Carla, who had once been the unquestioned authority in Greenwich, was now struggling to maintain any semblance of power. And Shaq was standing tall, his presence commanding attention. Carla's attempts to rally the crowd had fallen flat. She stammered, trying to gather her thoughts, but Shaq was having none of it. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a neatly folded piece of paper. The property map that would change everything. He held it up for the guests to see the evidence that she had no legal claim to the land she had turned into a wedding venue. This Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "Is my land? You never had permission to use it. You never even bothered to ask. You trespassed Carla, and now you owe me an apology and a check for the damage you've caused." The silence that followed was deafening. The guests who had been caught up in the frenzy of the moment now turned their attention to Carla. Their eyes, once filled with sympathy for her, were now full of doubt. The truth was, undeniable. Shaq wasn't the villain here. He was the victim of Carla's overreach, her arrogance, and her need to control everything. Carla's face went pale as the realization hit her. She had no legal right to any of this. Her attempts to use her status as HOA president to commandeer Shaq's property had failed spectacularly. She was standing on the wrong side of the law, and there was no way to talk her way out of it. What are you talking about?" Carla stammered, her eyes darting around the crowd, looking for some sign of support. But it was clear now that the guests were no longer on her side. They were starting to piece everything together. They were starting to see her for what she truly was, a woman who thought she was above the rules, above everyone else. Shaq didn't flinch. He stood there watching her, waiting for the inevitable moment when the reality of the situation would fully sink in. "I've been pushed around for years, Carla. Every HOA meeting, every snide comment, every little jab you threw my way. But this time you went too far. You stepped on my land, my property, and you thought you could get away with it. Well, guess what? You can't. Not anymore." The guests, some of whom had already started recording the entire scene on their phones, began murmuring among themselves. A few exchanged glances, unsure how to react, but as the minutes passed, it became clear that they were beginning to understand who the real culprit was. It wasn't Shaq. It wasn't the animals. It was Carla, the woman who had spent years manipulating everyone in Greenwich with her rules and her sense of entitlement. As the murmurs grew louder, Carla's frustration mounted. She looked around the yard, her eyes wild with panic. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "I had permission. I had every right to be here." But the more she protested, the more her lies began to unravel. Shaq had already exposed her for what she was, and there was no turning back now. The guests were starting to see her for the tyrant she had been all along. And the other members of the HOA who had been watching the scene unfold in stunned silence were beginning to speak up. "I didn't know about this," one of them said, his voice low and accusing. "Carla, you told us the wedding was approved by the board, but you never mentioned Shaq's land was part of the deal." Another HOA member spoke up, shaking their head. "This is a mess. You've put all of us in a terrible position, Carla. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it. Carla was cornered, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. She had spent so much time and energy controlling every aspect of Greenridge. But now, for the first time, the tables had turned. The guests, the other HOA members, and even her own supporters were starting to turn on her. Shaq watched as the fallout began. He had no need to add more to the conversation. He had said his piece, and now it was up to the rest of the neighborhood to take action. Carla's reputation, once so carefully curated, was now in tatters. The guests who had once admired her were now quietly distancing themselves, their faces a mixture of disbelief and regret. The final blow came when one of the groom's family members, clearly furious, stormed up to Carla. "You lied to us. You said everything was taken care of. You said this was going to be a beautiful day. Well, look at it now. We've been duped, Carla." Carla opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She was trapped in a web of lies, and no amount of scrambling would get her out of it. The day that was supposed to be about love and celebration had turned into a nightmare, and Carla was the architect of it all. Shaq didn't need to say another word. The damage had been done, and Carla had no one to blame but herself. The silence that had descended over Shaq's backyard was almost deafening. What had once been a bustling scene of frantic wedding preparation had turned into a courtroom of sorts where the evidence was irrefutable and the guilty party stood exposed for all to see. The animals had long since finished their work, the goats now resting lazily in the corners of the yard, the cows having wandered off to munch on whatever grass remained untouched, and Sergeant Honkers, exhausted from his campaign of terror, had settled on the ground with a proud, dignified honk. But the real battle, the one that had been brewing for years, was just beginning. Carla Prescott stood in the middle of the yard, her face pale, her composure shattered. The microphone that she had clung to earlier was now lying discarded at her feet, her words reduced to nothing more than a jumble of incoherent protests. Her carefully constructed image of the perfect, all-knowing HOA president had crumbled in a matter of moments, and there was nothing she could do to repair the damage. Shaq could see it in her eyes. Her sense of control, her belief that she could bend everyone to her will was gone, and now she had to face the consequences. The first blow came from the groom's family. They had been standing on the sidelines watching the debacle unfold. But now they were stepping forward, their faces twisted in a mixture of anger and disbelief. "What the hell, Carla?" The groom's father shouted, his voice booming across the yard. "You lied to us. You said this was all clear, that everything was fine. Ora, look at what you've done." Carla's face flushed with a deep red, but she had no response. The reality was undeniable. She had lied. She had used her position as the HOA president to force her will upon others to manipulate situations for her own benefit. But now, with the entire neighborhood watching, there was no escaping the truth. The groom's mother was next, her voice cold and accusing. "You promised us a beautiful day, a perfect event. This is a joke. You've made fools of us all." She turned to the guests, gesturing to the mess that had once been. "A picturesque wedding setup, and you've made fools of yourselves following her lead. Look at this. This is ridiculous. More and more of the guests began to murmur in agreement. The earlier tension there had dissipated, replaced by a growing sense of outrage. Carla had deceived them, manipulated them into thinking everything was fine when it was anything but. The perfect, pristine neighborhood that she had so carefully cured was starting to unravel, and now the cracks were too obvious to ignore. Shaq stood at the edge of the scene, his arms folded across his chest. He didn't need to do anything more. The damage was done. The truth was out, and Carla had nowhere to hide. The crowd was turning on her, and her supporters were vanishing one by one. Those who had once praised her, who had believed she was the glue holding Greenwich together, were now seeing her for what she truly was. A woman who wielded power without understanding the responsibility that came with it. Carla's desperation grew. She reached out toward the guests, trying to salvage some semblance of control, but her words fell on deaf ears. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't what it looks like. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But her words were interrupted by one of the HOA members who had been standing in the background silently observing the scene. They stepped forward, shaking their head in disbelief. "Carla, you've lost all credibility. We trusted you to lead us, and this is how you repay us." The woman's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension that had settled over the yard. "You lied to us. You lied to all of us." Cha watched as Carla's face fell. She had no retort and no excuse. All of her usual bluster, the arrogance that had once defined her, had evaporated. She was standing alone now, surrounded by people who had once looked up to her, but now saw her for what she truly was. Her own words echoed in the silence. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she repeated, as if hoping that her apology would somehow undo the damage. But it was too late. The truth had been exposed, and no amount of pleading could change that. A few more HOA members, all of whom had been silent up until now or exchanged glances. It was clear that they, too, were beginning to see the full scope of what had transpired. This wasn't just about one wedding. This was about years of manipulation, years of trying to control every aspect of life in Greenwich, and now it had all come crashing down. "I think it's time we had a meeting," one of the HOA members said, their voice low but resolute. "An emergency meeting. Carla, you're not going to be able to talk your way out of this." Carla's face tightened with fury, but she knew deep down that she had no way out. She had been caught, and now the fallout was inevitable. The guests who had once seen her as the Queen of Greenridge were now seeing her for what she was. A woman who had let power go to her head. A woman who had used her position for personal gain. Shaq stepped forward, his presence commanding the attention of everyone at around him. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the tension to build before he finally broke the silence. "You know," he began, his voice steady and calm. "I didn't want any of this. I didn't want the animals to destroy the wedding. I didn't want the chaos to spiral out of control. But when you treat people like they don't matter, when you walk all over them and think there won't be any consequences, you end up with a mess. And that mess isn't mine, Carla. It's yours." The guests fell silent, processing his words. Carla's face twisted with embarrassment, her shoulders slumped in defeat. For the first time in years, Shaq could see the cracks in her facade, the image of perfection that she had so carefully cultivated falling apart before her eyes. The power she had once held so tightly was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As the last of the guests began to leave, shaking their heads in disbelief and whispering among themselves, Carla remained frozen in place, the weight of the situation finally settling in. She had no allies left. No one was going to stand up for her, and the reputation she had worked so hard to build was shattered, irreparably damaged. Shaq watched as she stood there isolated and defeated, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The balance had shifted. The days of Carla Prescott using her position to push him around were over. The neighborhood was waking up to the truth. And for the first time, Shaq wasn't the one on the outside looking in. He was the one who had stood his ground. And he had taken control of his land, of his life. And in doing so, he had shown everyone that there were consequences to actions, and that sometimes the quiet man who is pushed too far can be the one who changes everything. In this section, the fallout from Carla's actions becomes fully realized. The guests and HOA members turn on her, and her attempts to save face only make the situation worse. Shaq's calm resolution signals the shift in power as Carla's reign comes to an abrupt end. Let me know if you'd like to continue with the next part. The dust had barely settled in Shaq's backyard, but the true consequences of Carla Prescott's actions were about to unfold in the formal setting of the HOA meeting. What had started as a chaotic wedding had now spiraled into something much larger, something that was beyond Carla's control. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip, and everyone was talking about the event, about the destruction, about the animals running amok, and most importantly, about Carla's sudden fall from grace. The residents of Greenwich, who had once viewed Carla with a mixture of admiration, niche word use, and fear, were now turning against her. In the days that followed the wedding, the whispers and rumors grew louder, and the damage to Carla's reputation became undeniable. Shaq, however, wasn't one to bask. In the destruction, he knew that the real resolution would come in the form of the HOA meeting that had been scheduled in the aftermath of the wedding disaster. This meeting, called at the behest of several concerned neighbors, was where the true power of the situation would unfold. Carla had gone too far, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. The meeting room was packed with Green Ridge residents, all murmuring with anticipation as they took their seats. Carla, wearing her usual pastel pantsuit, but now looking less confident, sat at the front, her back rigid with defiance. She had tried to maintain some semblance of control over the situation in the days since the wedding, but the damage was done. Her facade of perfection had been shattered, and now she had to answer for everything. Chuck entered the room calm and collected, with no trace of the anger that had once burned in him. He had done what he needed to do, and now it was time to let the truth speak for itself. He walked to the back of the room, as his eyes briefly meeting Carla's. She glared at him, her lips tight, but there was something in her eyes now. Fear. She knew what was coming. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it was clear that the focus was on the events of the previous weekend. The chairperson, a woman named Linda, called the meeting to order and immediately turned the floor over to Carla. The guests who had witnessed the chaos in Shaw's backyard were now gathered in the room, ready to share their stories. The HOA members who had been silent during the wedding were no longer passive bystanders. They were ready to hold Carla accountable. Carla stood up, straightening her suit, her hands shaking slightly. She cleared her throat before speaking. I know there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of frustration in the community over the wedding. She began, her voice brittle but still attempting to maintain control. But I want to make it clear that I did everything I could to ensure that the event was successful. I secured permission for the venue and everything was in order. The situation with the animals was unexpected. Her words were met with a low murmur from the crowd. Carla paused, waiting for the murmurs to quiet down before continuing. I know that some of you might feel upset about what happened, but I am asking for your understanding. This was a mistake, and I'm taking full responsibility. Shaq's eyes narrowed. This wasn't an apology. This was an attempt to cover up her actions, to salvage whatever shred of respect she had left. Carla wasn't owning up to what had truly happened. She was still trying to manipulate the narrative. Linda, the chairperson, spoke next. Carla, with all due respect, you're not the only one responsible for what happened at that wedding. We've heard from several people who attended, and it's clear that you made some serious missteps in your role as HOA president. But there's more. You made decisions without consulting the rest of us, without even ensuring that the land you were using for the wedding belonged to the HOA. Several of the HOA members nodded in agreement, and the room seemed to shift in energy. The tables were turning, and Carla could feel it. The truth was coming to light, and she was no longer the authority figure she once thought herself to be. I had to act quickly, Carla stammered. The couple paid HOA for the space. I thought I had all the right permissions. You didn't even check with Shaq. Linda interrupted, her voice calm but firm. This isn't just a simple misunderstanding, Carla. Well, you disregarded Shaq's property rights and imposed your own vision without considering the consequences. You took it upon yourself to assume that his land was HOA property. And you didn't even ask him. Carla opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. The facts were now clear, and she could no longer deny them. Shaq had a right to his land, and she had trespassed on it. The other members of the HOA were no longer looking at her as the unquestioned leader. They were seeing her as the person who had abused her power and made reckless decisions. A man from the back of the room, a longtime resident of Greenwich, stood up. I was there. He said, his voice low and steady. I saw the whole thing. And Carla promised the couple that everything was handled, that they'd be able to use Shaq's land for the wedding. But Shaq never agreed to it. He wasn't even consulted. And now we've got a ruined wedding. And not to mention the mess she's left behind. Oh. The man's words hung in the air, and the room fell silent. One by one, more guests who had been at the wedding stood up recounting their experiences. Some were angry, some were disappointed, but all were in agreement that Carla's actions had been wrong. This wasn't just about a ruined wedding. It was about Carla's complete disregard for the community she had sworn to serve. Shaq could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the reckoning he had been waiting for. The truth had finally come to light, and Carla's attempts to manipulate the narrative were no longer working. She had lied. She had manipulated. And now she was being held accountable. As the testimonies continued, Carla's face grew increasingly pale as she had no defense left. The guests and HOA members who had once been loyal to her were now turning their backs on her. The power she had wielded so effortlessly for years was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Linda, seeing the turning tide, spoke again. Carla, we cannot let this go unchecked. Your actions have caused harm, not just to Shaq, but to everyone in this neighborhood. You've lost the trust of the people here today. The board has decided that effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties as HOA president. We will be scheduling an election to appoint a new leader. The room was silent for a moment, and then there was a murmur of agreement. Carla stood there, her eyes wide with disbelief. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. The decision had been made, and there was no changing it. Shaq watched from the back of the room, arms folded, his expression calm. The battle had been long, but it was over. Carla Prescott, the woman who had tried to control everything, had been exposed for what she truly was, and now justice had been served. Well, a few days had passed since the chaos of the HOA meeting, and Greenwich was slowly returning to its quiet, predictable rhythm. The whispers about the wedding fiasco still lingered in the air, but the dust had settled. People had gone back to their routines, some with a new sense of respect for Shaq, and others with a deeper understanding of just how much damage one person's unchecked power could cause. Shaq had done what he needed to do, and now it was time to enjoy the calm that had followed the storm. He spent his days in the familiar quiet of his farmhouse, tending to his animals and enjoying the simple, peaceful life that had always brought him satisfaction. The goats Tina and Ted were still their usual troublemaking selves, but there was an odd joy in watching them hop around the yard, their antics a reminder of the light-heartedness that life could bring. Sergeant Honkers, though a bit more subdued after his epic rampage at the Curb wedding, still strutted around like he owned the place, honking at anything that moved in his path. The cows, now well-fed and content, leisurely roamed the field, taking their time as they chewed the grass beneath their hooves. It was, as always, the perfect kind of the peace. But the quiet wasn't the only thing that had returned to Shaq's life. Respect had found its way back into the neighborhood, too. People who had once been too intimidated by Carla's domineering presence were now speaking to Shaq with newfound admiration. They recognized him not as the outsider that Carla had tried to label him, but as a man who stood up for what was right. Still, Shaq didn't go out of his way to seek attention. He never had. He wasn't the type of man who craved accolades or praise, but what he had gained in the end was something far more valuable: his dignity. A few days after the meeting, Shaq received an unexpected visitor at his doorstep. It was the bride from the wedding, her eyes still a little puffy from crying, though the sadness in her expression had been replaced with something that looked more like genuine remorse. "Shag," she said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. "I owe you an apology. You were right. I didn't know what was going on behind the scenes. I had no idea my wedding was causing such a mess for you in your land, and I'm sorry for everything that happened." I never meant for it to get out of hand like that." Shaq stood on the porch for a moment, taking in her words. He had heard all the rumors and seen the damage firsthand, but hearing her say it out loud was different. The apology wasn't something he had expected, and to be honest, he wasn't sure what to do with it. "Don't worry about it," Shaq replied with a slight shrug. "It wasn't your fault. You were caught in the middle of something bigger than a wedding." He paused for a moment, considering his words. "Carla messed up. She should have made sure everything was above board. But it's not on you." The bride, still looking conflicted, nodded slowly. "I know. I feel terrible about it. I've already talked to my mom, and she's going to reach out to you to pay for the damages. I know it won't fix everything, but it's the least we can do." Shaq nodded, appreciating her gesture. "That's not necessary. The real problem was never the wedding itself. It was what led up to it. The way people like Carla think they can just do whatever they want and ignore the people who actually own the land. It's been a long time coming." The bride smiled faintly, clearly relieved. "Well, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. Well, and thank you for not causing more trouble than was already caused. It was an absolute nightmare for, everyone involved. But I think we're all better for having learned from it." Shaq didn't say much else. He just nodded and gave her a small smile as she turned to leave. But in that moment, he felt something he hadn't expected: closure. The weight that had hung on him for so long, the burden of feeling like he didn't belong, had finally been lifted. He didn't need an apology from the bride to feel vindicated. He had already done what needed to be done. But hearing it, seeing her take responsibility, reminded him that sometimes things did work out in the end. The next day, Shaq received the check from the bride's mother, as promised. It wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the acknowledgement that things had been wrong and that they were willing to make it right. The check, in a strange way, symbolized the final piece of the puzzle. It was proof that the community was willing to move forward, that they recognized the wrongs of the past and were ready to rebuild. Shaq didn't cash the check right away. Instead, he left it in his desk drawer, tucked away with a few other important papers. The check wasn't the point. The point was that it was no longer about fighting for respect. He had earned it not just from the people who had once dismissed him, but from himself. A few weeks later, the HOA held its election to select a new president, and to no one's surprise, Carla was absent from the ballot. The members of the community had seen her for who she was, and they had no interest in letting her continue to hold power. The new president was someone more grounded, someone who understood the value of fairness and respect for everyone in the neighborhood, not just those with the loudest voices. As for Shaq, life in Greenwich returned to its quiet rhythm. He went back to tending his farm and his animals, not looking for conflict, but ready to stand his ground if it came to him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. But, the lesson he had learned, and perhaps the lesson that Greenwich had learned too, was that power, if when wielded recklessly, could destroy more than it built. But respect earned through action and integrity was the one thing that could restore it. He often thought back to the events of that chaotic wedding day. It had been the turning point, the moment when everything shifted. And while he would never forget the madness, he also wouldn't forget what came after. The way people came together to hold Carla accountable, to make things right, and to finally see that everyone deserved a voice, even the quiet ones. Shaq smiled to himself as he watched his animals graze in the field, peaceful and content. The neighborhood was healing, and so was E. And in the end, it wasn't just about a garden hose. It was about boundaries, about respect, and about how one man stood up, not with violence or rage, but with creativity, patience, and a little bit of poetic justice. Jamal Brooks reminded all of us that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't require shouting. Just a camera, a little planning, and the nerve to say enough is enough. But we have to ask, was Jamal right to fight back the way he did, or did he go too far? Do petty actions deserve petty consequences? Or is that just another cycle of revenge? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if stories like these make you pause, reflect, or even laugh, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Soulful Stories of Fu for more unforgettable neighborhood tales where truth is stranger than fiction. Because sometimes, karma doesn't knock. It just turns on the hose.